Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about two young women brutally murdered in their Melbourne home in 1977 while a toddler slept in his cot nearby. A case that remained unsolved for nearly half a century. An investigation that generated 130 persons of interest but no arrests. Until September 2024, when a 65-year-old man was arrested at an airport in Rome. This is the story of the Easy Street murders. Collingwood, Melbourne, 1977. It was a working-class inner suburb, rough around the edges, with narrow streets lined with Victorian-era terraces and weatherboard cottages. In the mid-1970s, Collingwood was transitioning. The old Italian and Greek immigrant communities that had dominated since the post-war years were still there, but they were being joined by students, artists, and young professionals drawn by cheap rent and proximity to the city center. It was the world captured in Helen Garner's novel Monkey Grip, bohemian but gritty, countercultural but struggling, a place where different social worlds brushed against each other on streets like Smith Street and Johnston Street. At 147, Easy Street lived two young women who'd been friends since high school. Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett had grown up in Benalla, a regional town in northern Victoria. They'd maintained their friendship after school, and when both moved to Melbourne, they decided to share a house. Suzanne Armstrong was 27 years old in January 1977. She had a 16-month-old son named Gregory. She'd conceived him while staying on the Greek island of Naxos and had returned to Australia to raise him as a single mother. Those who knew Suzanne described her as vivacious, warm, someone who embraced life despite the challenges of single parenthood in an era when it carried more stigma than it does today. Susan Bartlett was 28 years old. She worked as a schoolteacher at the Collingwood Education Centre, a progressive alternative school that served local students. Susan was passionate about education, about helping children, about making a difference in the community. She was creative, teaching arts and crafts, encouraging her students to express themselves. The two women shared the small house at 147 Easy Street. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. They had their routines, their social lives, their plans for the future. Suzanne was focused on raising Gregory. Susan was committed to her teaching. They were living ordinary lives in an ordinary house in an ordinary suburb. Nothing about their circumstances suggested they were in danger. They had no known enemies. They weren't involved in criminal activity. They were simply two young women living their lives. On Monday, January 10th, 1977, Suzanne and Susan went about their normal day. Susan would have been at school. Suzanne would have been caring for Gregory. They may have gone out that evening, or they may have stayed home. The exact details of their final hours have never been established with certainty. What is certain is that sometime between the evening of January 10th and the early hours of January 11th, someone entered the house at 147 Easy Street and brutally murdered both women. Thursday, January 13th, 1977. 3 days after the murders, a neighbor became concerned. They'd noticed mail piling up outside 147 Easy Street. They could hear a child crying inside the house, crying that had been going on for what seemed like too long. Something was wrong. The neighbor entered the house. What they found would become one of Melbourne's most horrific crime scenes. Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett were both dead, their bodies showing signs of a frenzied knife attack. Each woman had been stabbed multiple times. The violence had been extreme, brutal, sustained. This wasn't a simple killing. It was an attack driven by rage or frenzy or something darker. Suzanne had been sexually assaulted. She'd been raped, either during or after her death. Susan appeared to have been killed while trying to help her friend, suggesting she'd heard the attack and had come to Suzanne's aid, only to be killed herself. In a cot near Suzanne's body, 16-month-old Gregory was alive. He was distressed, crying, dehydrated, but physically unharmed. He'd been alone with his mother's corpse for approximately 3 days, surviving on whatever food and water he could reach. The killer had left him alive. Whether this was mercy or oversight, no one could say. But Gregory had been in that house with the bodies, helpless and alone, for 72 hours. Police were called immediately. Homicide detectives arrived at the scene and began their investigation. What they found was both helpful and frustrating. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, though a footprint on a front windowsill suggested someone may have entered through the window. The kitchen light had been left on. A note from Suzanne's boyfriend, who'd visited after the murders without realizing what had happened inside, was found on the kitchen table. Another note pinned to the front door mentioned a lost puppy. The murder weapon, a knife, was never found. The killer had taken it with them or disposed of it elsewhere. But there was biological evidence. Semen was found at the scene, evidence of the sexual assault. In 1977, DNA testing didn't exist. The sample could be blood-typed but not analyzed in ways that would identify an individual uniquely. Still, it was preserved, cataloged, stored. Someday, technology might advance enough to use it. The murders shocked Melbourne. 2 young women, brutally killed in their own home, a toddler left alone with the bodies. The violence was shocking even in a city that had seen its share of crime. Victoria Police launched one of the largest murder investigations in the state's history. A dedicated team of detectives worked the case, interviewing witnesses, following leads, building a profile of the potential killer. They established a timeline. Suzanne and Susan had been alive on the evening of January 10th. They were dead by the morning of January 11th. The window for the murders was narrow, approximately 12 to 18 hours. Had the women known their killer? Had someone targeted them specifically? Or was this a random attack, a predator who'd seen an opportunity? The lack of forced entry suggested either the killer had been let in by one of the women, or they'd entered through the window without making noise that would alert the occupants. The sexual assault suggested a male perpetrator. The extreme violence suggested rage, loss of control, or a deliberate choice to inflict maximum harm. Investigators compiled a list of persons of interest. Eventually, that list would grow to 130 names. Construction workers from a building site behind the house on Hoddle Street. Men who'd been seen in the area. Former boyfriends, acquaintances, anyone who couldn't account for their whereabouts on the night of January 10th to 11th. Each person was investigated. Alibis were checked. Backgrounds were examined. But no clear suspect emerged. No one stood out as obviously guilty. One person of particular interest was a crime reporter who'd been staying in a house next door to 147 Easy Street on the night of the murders. This reporter had connections to another unsolved case, the disappearance and presumed murder of Julie Garcia-Slay, a librarian who'd vanished from her North Melbourne apartment in July 1975. The potential connection between the cases was explored, but nothing definitive emerged. The reporter was interviewed, investigated, but never charged. In 1978, a year after the murders, the Victorian government offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to the killer's arrest and conviction. It was a substantial sum, enough to motivate someone who knew something to come forward. No one did, or at least no one came forward with information that cracked the case. As the years passed, the investigation lost momentum. Detectives retired or moved to other cases. The files on the Easy Street murders grew thick with reports and statements and dead ends, but no closer to identifying the killer. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Easy Street murders remained unsolved. The case became part of Melbourne folklore, a story people told to illustrate how even the most brutal crimes could go unpunished. The house at 147 Easy Street was sold in 1983, 6 years after the murders. It had sat empty all that time, a crime scene that no one wanted to own. New occupants moved in, living with the knowledge of what had happened there. The property changed hands again over the years. Each sale generated renewed media interest in the case. Journalists would write retrospective pieces. Detectives would be interviewed about the investigation. But nothing new emerged. Gregory Armstrong, Suzanne's son, was adopted and raised in Queensland by his mother's younger sister. He grew up knowing what had happened but spared the worst details. His aunt became an advocate for solving the case, keeping it in the public consciousness, maintaining pressure on authorities to never give up. In 1999, a significant development occurred. DNA testing technology had advanced to the point where the semen sample from the crime scene could be analyzed and a genetic profile created. This profile was compared to samples from 8 prime suspects, men who'd been at the top of the investigative list for years. None of them matched. The 8 men who'd been considered most likely to be the killer were definitively ruled out by DNA evidence. This was both progress and setback. Progress because it eliminated innocent suspects. Setback because it meant the investigation had to start over, looking at people who'd been lower down the list or hadn't been considered at all. In 2011, the case was quietly reopened under the supervision of Detective Ron Iddles, one of Victoria's most respected homicide investigators. Iddles brought fresh eyes to old evidence, used modern investigative techniques to re-examine witness statements and forensic findings. But even Iddles, despite his reputation and skill, couldn't crack the case immediately. The trail was too cold. Too much time had passed. Witnesses had died or couldn't remember clearly. Evidence had degraded. In 2017, on the 40th anniversary of the murders, Victoria Police announced a $1 million reward for information leading to the killer's conviction. It was one of the highest rewards ever offered in Australian criminal history, a sign of how seriously authorities took the case. The announcement generated significant media coverage. Books had been written about the case, including Helen Thomas's murder on Easy Street. Podcasts had covered it. The story was well known in Melbourne and beyond, but still, no one came forward with the information that would solve it. What the public didn't know in 2017, what wouldn't be revealed until years later, was that investigators had begun using advanced DNA techniques to re-examine the evidence. In 2018, the semen sample from the crime scene was subjected to more sophisticated analysis. Forensic scientists worked to extract every possible piece of genetic information from the degraded 41-year-old sample. The analysis yielded results, but the DNA profile didn't match anyone in Australian criminal databases. Whoever had left that sample had either never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA sampling or had left Australia before such databases were established. Investigators began looking at vehicles. 130 persons of interest had been investigated over the decades. Some of them had owned cars in 1977. If those cars still existed, if they'd been preserved somehow, could DNA be extracted from them? It's unclear exactly how investigators zeroed in on one particular vehicle, but somehow they did. A car that had been owned in 1977 by someone connected to the investigation. Whether through genealogical DNA, through new witness testimony, through re-examination of old evidence, or through some combination of these, a specific car became a focus. In 2018, forensic analysis was conducted on this vehicle. Blood was found on the seats. Semen stains were detected. DNA was extracted and compared to the profile from the Easy Street crime scene. It was a match. The same person who'd left biological evidence in the house at 147, Easy Street had also left it in this particular vehicle. The owner of that vehicle in 1977 was a man named Perikles Kouroumblis, known as Perry. He was a Greek-Australian dual citizen. In 1977, he'd been 19 years old, living in Melbourne. After 1977, Kouroumblis had left Australia. He'd eventually settled in Greece, living quietly, building a life far from Melbourne and far from the crime he allegedly committed. For years, Victoria Police conducted surveillance, gathered evidence, built their case. They couldn't arrest him in Greece. Extradition would be complex, and they needed their case to be solid before requesting it. Then, on September 19, 2024, Kouroumblis made a mistake. He flew to Rome, Italy. And Italy, unlike Greece, has an extradition treaty with Australia. Victoria Police contacted Italian authorities. An arrest warrant was issued. When Perry Kouroumblis arrived at the airport in Rome, police were waiting. Perry Corumbles was 65 years old when he was arrested at the airport in Rome. 47 years had passed since the Easy Street murders. He'd lived most of his adult life in freedom, far from the country where he allegedly committed one of its most notorious crimes. He was taken into custody by Italian authorities. Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Shane Patton described the case publicly for the first time since the arrest, calling it one of Victoria's longest cold cases, an absolutely gruesome, horrific, frenzied homicide. Corumbles initially contested the extradition request, but eventually, through his lawyer, he indicated he wouldn't fight it. He claimed he was innocent of the murders and intended to clear his name. On December 3, 2024, Corumbles was extradited to Australia. He arrived in Melbourne under police custody, beginning the legal process that would determine whether he would stand trial. On December 4, 2024, Corumbles appeared in court represented by prominent criminal defense lawyer Bill Doog. He was formally charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape in connection with the deaths of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett. The prosecution outlined their case. DNA from the crime scene matched DNA from Corumbles' 1977 car. Blood on the car seats, semen stains in the vehicle, the same genetic profile at both locations. The defense would argue, as it must, that DNA evidence alone isn't proof of guilt. That contamination is possible. That the chain of custody over 47 years could have been compromised. That being in a location isn't the same as committing a crime there. A committal hearing was scheduled for October 2025, where 19 witnesses would testify and a magistrate would determine whether there was sufficient evidence for the case to proceed to trial in the Supreme Court. As of late 2025, that committal hearing has concluded. Corumbles has indicated he will plead not guilty. The case is proceeding toward what will be one of the most closely watched trials in Australian legal history. Even with an arrest, even with charges laid, many questions about the Easy Street murders remain unanswered. If Perry Corumbles is guilty, as the DNA evidence suggests, what was his connection to Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett? Did he know them? Was this a planned attack or a random encounter that escalated? Why was the violence so extreme? Multiple stab wounds to both women suggest rage or frenzy. Was this personal? Or was it the signature of someone capable of extreme violence regardless of whether he knew his victims? Why was Gregory left alive? Was it mercy? Oversight? The killer, having committed such brutal acts on the women, apparently didn't harm the child. This suggests some limit to his violence, some boundary he wouldn't cross. Or perhaps he simply didn't notice the child in the cot. Why did Corumbles leave Australia after 1977? Did he flee because he feared arrest? Or did he leave for unrelated reasons, perhaps to be with family in Greece, and simply never returned? Did police in 1977 interview Corumbles? Was he on the list of 130 persons of interest? If so, why wasn't he identified as a suspect then? If not, why not? These questions may be answered during trial, if the case proceeds to trial and if Corumbles testifies or if the evidence speaks clearly enough. Or they may remain mysteries, details lost to time and the passage of 47 years. What is clear is that DNA technology has finally provided the break investigators needed. The semen sample preserved in 1977, blood-typed but not fully analyzable at the time, has yielded its secrets through modern forensic science. Genetic genealogy, advanced DNA extraction techniques, and improved databases have accomplished what decades of traditional investigation couldn't. They've provided a name, a suspect, a pathway to potential justice. For Gregory Armstrong, now approaching 50 years old, the arrest represents something he's waited his entire life for. The man accused of killing his mother, of leaving him alone with her corpse for 3 days, may finally face justice. Suzanne Armstrong was 27 years old when she was murdered. Susan Bartlett was 28. They were young women with their lives ahead of them, with families who loved them, with contributions still to make to the world. Their murders were brutal, senseless, apparently motiveless. 2 women who'd done nothing wrong, killed in their own home while a toddler slept nearby. For 47 years, their killer went unpunished. For 47 years, their families waited for justice. For 47 years, the case haunted Melbourne and puzzled investigators. Perry Kurumbliss, if he is guilty, lived nearly 5 decades as a free man. He built a life in Greece. He had family, friends, a normal existence, all while the families of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett lived with permanent grief and unanswered questions. The DNA evidence is compelling. The match between the crime scene and Kurumbliss's car is strong, but he's entitled to the presumption of innocence, to his day in court, to the opportunity to contest the evidence against him. If he's convicted, it will be one of the longest delays between crime and conviction in Australian history. Justice delayed to an almost unprecedented degree, but justice nonetheless. If he's acquitted, if the evidence proves insufficient for conviction, the Easy Street murders will remain officially unsolved, though the cloud of suspicion will forever hang over Kurumbliss's name. Either way, the arrest represents progress. After 47 years of dead ends, investigators finally have a suspect in custody. The case that seemed unsolvable has finally moved forward. For the families, for Gregory Armstrong, who lost his mother that night, for everyone who's followed this case over the decades, the arrest provides hope that answers are finally coming. The trial, when it occurs, will be watched closely across Australia and beyond. It represents not just justice for 2 women murdered in 1977, but proof that cold cases can be solved, that advances in forensic science can reach back through decades to identify killers who thought they'd gotten away with it. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share the story of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett. Remember them not just as victims, but as young women whose lives mattered. Thank you for listening tonight. Story 2. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a schoolteacher who sold her house, changed her name to something bizarre, and flew to Europe in 1997, never to be seen again. A case that police dismissed for over a decade. A daughter who refused to give up. And a con man with a trail of devastated women and stolen identities across 3 continents. This is the story of Marion Barter, the lady who vanished. Marion Barter was born on October 3, 1945, in Australia. By 1997, at 51 years old, she'd lived a full life marked by romance, disappointment, and resilience. Marion had been married 3 times. Her first husband was Johnny Warren, who would become one of Australia's most famous soccer players and commentators. That marriage didn't last. Neither did her second or third marriages. By the mid-1990s, Marion was a single mother to 2 adult children, Sally and Owen. She worked as a primary school teacher at the Southport School on the Gold Coast in Queensland. Those who knew her described Marion as dedicated, warm, someone who loved ballet, opera, the finer things in life. She was cultured, refined, a woman who appreciated beauty and elegance. But Marion's romantic life had been a source of pain. 3 failed marriages weighed on her. She longed to be loved, to find the connection that had eluded her. At 51, she was at a crossroads, looking for something more, something different. In early 1997, Marion began making unusual decisions. In March, she abruptly resigned from her teaching position at the Southport School, quitting mid-semester in a move that surprised her colleagues. She announced she was taking a sabbatical to Europe. She sold her house on the Gold Coast, telling her children she planned to downsize when she returned. She put her beloved antiques into storage with the understanding that she'd either come back for them or have them shipped if she settled in Europe. Then, in May 1997, Marion did something extraordinary. She legally changed her name. Her new name was Florabella Natalia Marion Remakel. It was an elaborate, unusual name. Nothing like Marion Barter. She didn't tell her children about the name change. She didn't tell her friends. She simply filed the paperwork, obtained a new passport, and became Florabella Remakel. On June 22, 1997, Marian's friend dropped her off at a bus stop in Southport. Marian was heading to Brisbane Airport to catch her flight to England. She was excited, embarking on what she called the trip of a lifetime. She boarded her flight and left Australia behind. Her passenger card stated she was divorced and intended to reside in Luxembourg. For a few weeks after arriving in Europe, Marian kept in contact with her daughter Sally. She called regularly, sent messages, seemed to be enjoying her travels. Nothing in their conversations suggested anything was wrong. On July 31st, 1997, Marian called Sally from Tunbridge Wells in Kent, England. They talked until Marian ran out of coins for the payphone. Marian said she missed her family. She gave no indication she wouldn't be in contact again soon. That was the last time Sally Layden spoke to her mother. When Marian stopped calling, Sally wasn't immediately alarmed. Her mother was traveling, experiencing Europe, possibly distracted by new places and people. Perhaps she was simply busy. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Sally tried calling hotels Marian had mentioned staying at. She tried tracking her mother through travel agencies. Nothing. By October 1997, Sally was deeply concerned. She reported her mother missing to Byron Bay Police Station. The response she received was dismissive. Police told Sally that Marian had chosen to disappear, that she wanted no contact with her family, that this was voluntary and Sally should respect her mother's wishes. Sally knew this was wrong. Her mother wouldn't just cut off contact. They'd been close. Marian adored her grandchildren. She wouldn't miss birthdays and special occasions without explanation. Something was wrong. But police wouldn't listen. Marian had sold her house, withdrawn money, changed her name, and left the country. To investigators, this looked like someone planning to start a new life. They saw no evidence of foul play, no signs of abduction. Marian was an adult. If she wanted to disappear, that was her right. Sally was left in limbo. Her mother was gone. Police wouldn't investigate. She had no idea where Marian was or what had happened to her. Then, information began to emerge that made everything even more bizarre. In 2009, 12 years after Marian disappeared, a cold case detective named Gary Sheehan finally took Sally's concerns seriously. He began investigating properly for the first time. What he discovered shocked everyone. Marian had returned to Australia. On August 2nd, 1997, just one day after her last phone call to Sally, a passport in the name of Florabella Natalia Marian Remakel had been recorded entering Australia through Brisbane Airport. The incoming passenger card stated that Florabella was married, lived in Luxembourg, and was only staying in Australia for 3 days. Marian had been back in Australia. In early August 1997, she'd been somewhere in her home country, but she hadn't contacted her children. She hadn't gone to see them. She'd arrived and apparently vanished within days. Even more disturbing was what happened to Marian's bank account. In October 1997, large sums of money began being withdrawn. Over $80,000 was drained from her account in increments, methodically emptied until nothing remained. Someone had access to Marian's money. Someone was withdrawing it systematically. But was it Marian herself? Or had someone else gained control of her accounts? The name Florabella Natalia Marian Remakel was the key to unlocking the mystery. It was so unusual, so specific, that it had to mean something. Why would Marian choose that particular surname? Detective Sheehan investigated. The name Remakel wasn't random. It belonged to a real person. Fernand Remakel, a man from Luxembourg. In the early 1980s, Fernand Remakel had been married to a woman named Monique Cornelius. During their marriage, Monique had a romantic relationship with another man, a charming but mysterious figure who'd swept her off her feet. This man had told Monique he was a special agent for the British government. He'd written her florid love letters, promising to sail off into a new life with her. He'd been secretive, exciting, dangerous. While involved with Monique, this man had stolen Fernand Remakel's identity. He'd used Remakel's documents, his name, his identity for his own purposes. That man's real name was Rick Blum. Rick Blum was born in Belgium in 1938. His early life was marked by instability and crime. He'd been convicted of theft in Europe as a young man. He'd migrated to Australia, married, presented himself as respectable. But behind the facade was a pattern. Blum targeted women, particularly women who were lonely, vulnerable, seeking love. He'd romance them, gain their trust, convince them to sell their property or give him access to money. Then he'd disappear, taking their cash, their jewelry, their identities. The podcast, The Lady Vanishes, which began investigating Marion's case in 2019, uncovered multiple women who'd been victimized by Blum. Monique Cornelius in Luxembourg in the 1980s. Jeanette Gaffney Bowen, who met Blum in the late 1990s and allegedly lost $30,000. Janet Oldenburg, who Blum offered a new life in the French Riviera before abandoning her in the UK and stealing her documents. Ghislaine Danlois Dubois, who lost 60,000 euros after Blum encouraged her to sell her house. Multiple other women across Australia and Europe, all with similar stories of romance, trust, theft, and abandonment. Blum's pattern was consistent. He'd place Lonely Hearts advertisements in newspapers. He'd use false names and identities. He'd charm women, make promises, and steal from them. In 1994, Blum had placed an advertisement describing himself as a single, 47-year-old, tall, dark, sober man looking for a relationship with a view to marriage. He'd placed that ad using the name Fernand Remakel, the same surname Marion would later adopt. Had Marion answered that advertisement? Had she met Rick Blum? Was he the reason she'd changed her name, sold her house, and left the country? For years, Sally Layden fought to have her mother's disappearance properly investigated. She campaigned, gave interviews, refused to accept police dismissals. In 2019, The Lady Vanishes podcast began. Hosted by journalists Allison Sandy and Brian Seymour, with Sally's participation, the podcast meticulously pieced together Marion's story. It examined evidence, interviewed witnesses, followed leads police had ignored. The podcast became a phenomenon. 14 million downloads. Listeners around the world became invested in finding out what happened to Marion. Amateur sleuths contributed research, tracked down witnesses, uncovered connections. The public pressure, combined with new evidence, finally forced action. In 2019, the NSW Unsolved Homicide Squad took over the case. Marion's disappearance was now being treated as a suspected homicide. In June 2021, a coronial inquest began before Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan. The inquest would hear evidence over multiple sessions spanning nearly 3 years. The central question: what happened to Marion Barter? Detective Senior Constable Gary Sheehan testified about the botched original investigation. He acknowledged that crucial opportunities had been missed. For a decade, between 1997 and 2007, very little happened. The case had slipped through the cracks. I formed the opinion that this matter had not been investigated as thoroughly as it should have been, Sheehan testified. He described discovering that Marion had changed her name and returned to Australia, information that should have been uncovered immediately but had taken years to find. The inquest heard from Marion's family, from her friends, from colleagues. They described a woman who was loving, dedicated, who would never voluntarily abandon her children and grandchildren. Then the inquest turned to Rick Blum. In February 2022, Rick Blum, then 83 years old, appeared at the inquest. He arrived using a walker, appearing frail, confused, elderly. His hands shook. He muttered. He took long pauses before answering questions. But what he admitted, for the first time publicly, changed everything. Rick Blum acknowledged he'd had an affair with Marion Barter. For 4 months, from February to June 1997, just before Marion left Australia, they'd been romantically involved. They'd met through his Lonely Hearts advertisement, the one placed under the name Fernand Remakel. Marion had answered it. They'd met 3 or 4 times at her home while Blum's wife remained unaware. This was the missing piece. The connection between Marion and Blum that investigators had suspected but couldn't prove. But the coincidences went far beyond the affair. On June 17, 1997, 5 days before Marion left Australia, Rick Blum had flown out of the country using a false identity, Richard Lloyd Westbury. He traveled to Europe. On June 22, 1997, Marion left Australia for Europe. On July 31, 1997, Blum returned to Australia under his false identity. On August 2, 1997, Marion returned to Australia under her new name, Florabella Remakel. On October 14, 1997, Blum opened a safe custody envelope at the Commonwealth Bank in Ballina, a town in northern New South Wales. On October 15, 1997, $80,000 was transferred from Marion's bank account. The dates lined up perfectly. Blum and Marion had traveled to Europe and returned within days of each other. Money had been withdrawn from Marion's account the day after Blum accessed something at a bank. During the inquest, Blum denied knowing where Marion was. He denied having any contact with her after they both returned to Australia in 1997. He denied taking her money. He denied murdering her. "Are you kidding?" he said when asked directly if he'd killed Marion. But his testimony was evasive, contradictory, unconvincing. He claimed memory problems but could remember certain details with clarity. He denied things witnesses testified to, then later admitted them. He presented himself as a befuddled old man, but the pattern of his life told a different story. The inquest heard testimony from multiple women Blum had victimized. They described his methods, his lies, his thefts. The pattern was unmistakable. Monique Cornelius, the woman whose ex-husband's identity Blum had stolen, called him a very big and dangerous manipulator. On February 29, 2024, after nearly 3 years of proceedings, Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan handed down her findings. She declared Marion Barter deceased. The date of death was established as sometime after October 15, 1997, when Marion's Medicare card was last used at an optometrist in Grafton, New South Wales. But the coroner could not determine the cause, place, or manner of Marion's death. There was no body, no crime scene, no definitive evidence of how she died. What the coroner could determine was that Rick Blum does indeed know more about Marion's disappearance than he was admitting. The coroner's findings were scathing about the original police investigation. The case had been mishandled from the start. Sally's concerns had been dismissed. Critical evidence hadn't been collected. Witnesses hadn't been properly interviewed. The findings noted that Marion's behavior before leaving Australia was out of character. The sudden resignation, the house sale, the name change, all suggested she was being influenced or manipulated by someone. The timing of Blum's travels matching Marion's travels was too coincidental to ignore. The withdrawal of money from Marion's account immediately after Blum accessed a safe custody box was suspicious. But suspicion isn't proof. The coroner couldn't charge Blum with murder without evidence sufficient for prosecution. She could only note that he knew more than he'd testified to and recommend further investigation. The findings recommended that the NSW Police Cold Case Unit continue investigating and determine whether there's sufficient evidence to refer Blum to the Director of Public Prosecutions for charges. As of now, no charges have been laid. Rick Blum, now in his late 80s, remains free. If he knows what happened to Marion Barter, he's keeping that knowledge to himself. Throughout the inquest and the years of investigation, Sally Layden has been the driving force behind the search for her mother. She refused to accept police dismissals. She fought for the inquest. She participated in the podcast, sharing personal details of her mother's life, keeping Marion's story in the public consciousness. On the day the coroner's findings were handed down, the courtroom was packed. Supporters wore green, Marion's favorite color. Listeners of The Lady Vanishes from around the world tuned in to live streams, hoping for answers. The findings confirmed what Sally had always known. Her mother hadn't disappeared voluntarily. Something had happened to her. Someone was responsible. While the coroner's inability to determine cause of death or recommend charges was disappointing, the official declaration that Marion was dead, that the investigation had been botched, that Blum knew more than he'd admitted, was validation. Sally's brother Owen had died in 2016, before the inquest began. He never got answers about what happened to their mother. But Sally continues to fight. A $500,000 reward remains in place for information leading to the resolution of Marion's case. Crime Stoppers continues to accept tips. I want to do as much as I possibly can so that at the end of the day my grandchildren, their children, will know I did everything in my power to find out what happened to my mom, Sally has said. The Lady Vanishes podcast continues, documenting developments in the case, keeping pressure on investigators, ensuring Marion isn't forgotten. For Sally, the fight isn't over until she knows definitively what happened to her mother, until Marion's remains are found, until someone is held accountable. Marion Barter was 51 years old when she disappeared. She was a teacher, a mother, a grandmother. She loved ballet and opera and the finer things in life. She'd survived 3 failed marriages and was still looking for love when she met Rick Blum. What exactly happened to Marion remains unknown, but the pattern suggests she was manipulated, possibly coerced into changing her name and selling her property. She traveled to Europe, perhaps with or following Blum. She returned to Australia in early August 1997, and within weeks, she was gone, her bank account drained, her Medicare card last used on October 15th. Rick Blum's involvement is clear. His relationship with Marion, his matching travel dates, his access to a bank safe custody box the day before her money was transferred, his pattern of victimizing women, all point to his central role in her disappearance. But proving he murdered her, proving what happened to her body, proving the case beyond reasonable doubt, remains elusive. Marion Barter's case demonstrates the danger of dismissing missing person reports. Police assumptions that she'd left voluntarily cost decades of investigation. By the time authorities took Sally seriously, evidence had degraded, witnesses had died, the trail had gone cold. It also demonstrates the power of persistence. Sally Layden refused to give up. The journalists behind The Lady Vanishes refused to let the story die. Amateur investigators contributed crucial research. Together, they accomplished what police had failed to do for over 2 decades. They uncovered the truth about Marion's last months. If you have any information about Marion Barter's disappearance, Crime Stoppers New South Wales continues to accept tips. Even now, decades later, information could provide the final pieces of the puzzle. Marion deserves to be found. Sally deserves to know what happened to her mother. Rick Blum, if he knows, deserves to face justice. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Marion's story. Keep the pressure on for answers. Sometimes that continued attention is what finally brings justice. Thank you for listening tonight and for remembering Marion Barter, the lady who vanished. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a prime minister who dismissed his bodyguards and walked home from the cinema with his wife one February evening in 1986. A man shot dead on one of Stockholm's busiest streets. An investigation so bungled it became a national trauma. A case that spawned countless conspiracy theories and remained unsolved for 34 years. This is the story of the assassination of Olof Palme. Sven Olof Joachim Palme was born on January 30th, 1927, in Stockholm, Sweden, into an upper-class conservative family. His childhood was one of privilege and education. He learned German and English as a boy, attended Sweden's prestigious Sigtunaskollen boarding school, and showed early academic promise. But Palme's politics would diverge dramatically from his family's conservative values. After military service, he traveled to the United States on scholarship, studying at Kenyon College in Ohio, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1948. He returned to Sweden, completed a law degree at Stockholm University in 1951, and joined the Social Democratic Party. By the 1950s, Palme had become protege to Prime Minister Tage Erlander, serving as his personal secretary. He entered parliament in 1958 and rose rapidly through the party ranks. In 1969, Palm succeeded Erlander as both party leader and Prime Minister of Sweden, a position he would hold from 1969 to 1976 and again from 1982 until his death. As Prime Minister, Olof Palme was a polarizing figure. To his supporters, he was a champion of social justice, a voice for the developing world, an advocate for nuclear disarmament and international peace. To his detractors, he was sanctimonious, self-righteous, a moralist who lectured others while leading a small, neutral country. Palme was outspoken on the world stage in ways unusual for Swedish leaders. He condemned American policy in Vietnam, earning the ire of successive U.S. administrations. He criticized the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia with equal vigor. He was a fierce opponent of apartheid in South Africa, supporting the African National Congress when many Western nations would not. In the weeks before his death, Palme had given the keynote address at the Swedish People's Parliament against apartheid, declaring that apartheid cannot be reformed, it has to be abolished. He worked as a UN mediator in the Iran-Iraq War. He championed nuclear non-proliferation. He shaped modern Sweden's welfare state and its international identity as a neutral nation committed to peace and human rights. But his high profile and willingness to criticize powerful interests made him enemies. Foreign intelligence services, right-wing extremists, those who saw his politics as threats to their interests. On Friday, February 28, 1986, Olof Palme was 59 years old. He'd been prime minister for 4 years in his second term. He had plans for the evening, a simple trip to the cinema with his wife. February 28, 1986, was a cold winter evening in Stockholm. Palme had dismissed his security detail for the night, something he did regularly. He believed in living like an ordinary citizen, walking the streets of his capital without bodyguards, shopping in stores, taking the subway. It was quintessentially Swedish, this lack of security around high officials, a reflection of Sweden's egalitarian culture. Palme and his wife Lisbeth decided to see a film at the Grand Cinema on Sveavägen, one of Stockholm's main thoroughfares. The movie was The Brothers Mozart, a Swedish comedy. Their son Martin and his girlfriend would meet them there. The four watched the film together. It ended around 11 p.m. They said their goodnights outside the cinema. Martin and his girlfriend headed one direction. Olof and Lisbeth began walking home to their apartment in Stockholm's Old Town, about a 15-minute walk away. It was approaching midnight on a Friday. Sveavägen was busy, even at that late hour. Pedestrians, traffic, the usual urban activity. The Palmes walked along the street, an ordinary couple on an ordinary evening. At approximately 11:21 p.m., as the Palmes walked along Sveavägen near the intersection with Tunnelgaten, a man approached from behind. Without warning, he fired 2 shots at close range. The first bullet struck Olof Palme in the back, tearing through his body, severing his spinal cord. The second shot grazed Lisbeth's back, wounding but not seriously injuring her. Palme fell to the snow-covered pavement. Lisbeth screamed. The gunman fled, running east down Tunnelgaten toward the Momsgålnadsgatan area. A passing nurse stopped to help, not initially recognizing the fallen man. She attempted resuscitation. A taxi driver used his radio to call for help. 2 young women in a car nearby came to assist. An ambulance arrived within minutes. Palme was transported to Sabbatsberg Hospital, but the damage was too severe. At 12:06 a.m. on March 1, 1986, Sweden's prime minister was pronounced dead. The first murder of a Swedish national leader since King Gustav III in 1792. An assassination on a busy Stockholm street that no one had prevented, that no one had seen coming. The investigation that followed would become almost as infamous as the crime itself. From the first moments, crucial mistakes were made that would haunt the case for decades. The crime scene was not properly secured. Members of the public walked through the area, laying flowers, obliterating footprints in the snow. The second bullet, the one that had grazed Lisbeth, wasn't found until 2 days later when a passing pedestrian spotted it. Hans Holmer, the Stockholm police commissioner, took charge of the investigation. Within days, he decided on a theory. Kurdish separatists, specifically the PKK, were responsible for Palm's murder. This theory was based on intelligence suggestions, not evidence. Holmer authorized raids on Kurdish communities in Sweden. Dozens of Kurds were questioned. Some were held for extended periods. The Swedish Kurdish community was traumatized by the treatment, and the entire line of investigation yielded nothing. No evidence connected the PKK to Palm's assassination. In 1987, after a year of chasing the Kurdish theory while other leads went unpursued, Holmer was removed from the case in disgrace. His successors fared little better. The investigation had lost crucial momentum in those first months. Conspiracy theories proliferated. Everyone from the CIA to South African intelligence to Chilean fascists to Swedish right-wing extremists was suspected. Some theories had plausibility. Palm had made powerful enemies through his international activism. Other theories were pure speculation, the kind that inevitably surrounds high-profile unsolved crimes. The investigation became a revolving door of theories and suspects. Over the decades, police would conduct 10,000 interviews, investigate 134 murder confessions, pursue countless leads. But the case remained unsolved. In 1988, 2 years after the murder, police arrested Christer Pettersson, a 41-year-old man with a criminal record including manslaughter and substance abuse. In 1989, he was convicted of Palm's murder based largely on Lisbeth Palm's identification of him in a lineup. But the conviction was overturned on appeal. The court ruled the evidence was insufficient. No murder weapon had been found. No motive established. The identification by Lisbeth was deemed unreliable given the traumatic circumstances. Christer Pettersson was released. He died in 2004, legally innocent of the assassination, though Lisbeth Palm maintained until her death in 2018 that he was the killer. Among the many witnesses who came forward on the night of Palm's murder was a man named Stig Engström. He worked as a graphic designer at Skandia, an insurance company whose headquarters were located near the crime scene. Engström claimed he'd been walking home from work, had heard the shots, and had been one of the first people on the scene. He said he'd tried to help resuscitate Palm. He gave detailed statements to police, describing what he'd seen and heard. But his accounts were inconsistent. Different versions of his story contradicted each other and didn't match testimony from other witnesses. Police noted the inconsistencies but didn't pursue Engström as a suspect in the initial investigation. He became known in media coverage as the Skandia Man, a witness, not a perpetrator. Engström died in 2000, apparently by suicide. For years, he remained a footnote in the Palm investigation, a witness whose statements hadn't been particularly helpful, but who wasn't seriously suspected. Then, in the 2010s, investigative journalist Thomas Pettersson became interested in the case. Pettersson spent 12 years researching Palm's assassination, combing through police files, interviewing witnesses, examining every aspect of the investigation. Pettersson became convinced that Stig Engström was the assassin. The inconsistencies in Engström's statements weren't the confused recollections of a traumatized witness. They were the lies of the killer, inserting himself into the investigation while trying to deflect suspicion. Pettersson discovered that Engström had training with weapons. He'd been a member of shooting clubs. He had access to firearms. More significantly, Engström had expressed extreme right-wing views, particularly hatred of Palm's politics. Engström was deeply opposed to Palm's stance on South African apartheid, his sympathy for leftist causes, his criticism of American policy. To Engström, Palm represented everything wrong with modern Sweden. In 2018, Pettersson published his findings in a book titled The Unlikely Murderer. The book made a detailed case that Engström had shot Palm, then contaminated the investigation by presenting himself as a helpful witness while providing false information. Pettersson's work caught the attention of prosecutors. In 2020, Chief Prosecutor Christer Petersson announced that after reviewing the evidence, he'd concluded there was reasonable evidence that Stig Engström had killed Olof Palme. On June 10, 2020, 34 years after Palme's assassination, Swedish prosecutors held a press conference that captivated the nation. Chief Prosecutor Christer Petersson announced that the investigation into Palme's murder was being closed. The most likely suspect, he declared, was Stig Engstrom, the Skandir man. The prosecutor outlined the case against Engstrom. His opportunity: he'd been in the immediate area when Palm was shot. His capability: he had weapons training and access to firearms, including a .357 Magnum revolver similar to the murder weapon. His motive: extreme opposition to Palm's politics, particularly regarding South Africa. But there were immediate problems with the conclusion. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. No murder weapon had ever been found. No forensic evidence linked Engstrom to the crime. No witnesses had placed him at the exact moment and location of the shooting. Engstrom had died in 2000, 20 years before the announcement. He couldn't be charged, couldn't stand trial, couldn't defend himself against the accusations. The prosecutor's announcement was not a conviction. It was an opinion about what probably happened, offered by an investigator who acknowledged the evidence was too weak to have ensured a conviction even if Engstrom were alive. The response from Swedish legal experts, journalists, and the public was mixed. Some saw the announcement as finally bringing closure to a case that had haunted Sweden for decades. Others viewed it as a convenient conclusion that blamed a dead man who couldn't defend himself. Jan Stoklasa, another journalist who'd written extensively about the Palm case, was highly critical. He argued that the evidence against Engstrom was weak, that alternative theories hadn't been adequately explored, that declaring the case closed was premature. Critics pointed out that Engstrom's supposed .357 Magnum had never been recovered or tested, that his alibis, while weak, had never been definitively disproven, that the prosecutor's case relied heavily on speculation about Engstrom's political views rather than concrete evidence of his presence at the crime scene. The Netflix series The Unlikely Murderer, based on Thomas Pettersson's book, dramatized Engstrom as Palm's killer, but even the series opened with the disclaimer, based on an unsolved crime, acknowledging that Engstrom's guilt had never been legally established. For Palm's family, the 2020 announcement was significant. Martin Palm, who'd last seen his father minutes before the assassination, stated he supported the Skandir man theory. It provided an answer, even if not a completely satisfying one. The failure to definitively solve Palm's murder has ensured that conspiracy theories have flourished for nearly 40 years. The South African connection was among the most plausible theories. In 1996, Colonel Eugene de Kock, a former South African police officer, testified that Palm had been targeted because of his opposition to apartheid and Sweden's substantial support for the ANC. South African intelligence had motive and capability. In 2020, Swedish investigators traveled to Pretoria to review South African files on the case, though nothing conclusive emerged. The CIA theory suggested American intelligence was involved, either directly or indirectly, as revenge for Palm's criticism of U.S. foreign policy. This theory was never substantiated beyond speculation, though Palm's vocal opposition to American actions in Vietnam and Central America had certainly strained Swedish-American relations. The PKK theory, despite being thoroughly investigated and found baseless, persists in some circles. In 2001, Swedish police even interviewed PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan in Turkish prison, but he denied any involvement. Swedish right-wing extremist police officers were suspected by some investigators. Klaus-Dieter Knapp, writing in the German weekly Die Zeit in 1995, presented a case that Swedish police with far-right sympathies had orchestrated the assassination. This theory suggested the investigation was sabotaged from within, explaining its spectacular failures. Some theories focused on Palm's role as UN mediator in the Iran-Iraq war. Had he uncovered something that made him dangerous to parties in that conflict? Had his peace efforts threatened interests that preferred the war to continue? The truth is probably simpler than the elaborate conspiracies suggest. Stig Engstrom may well have been the killer, a right-wing extremist acting alone, motivated by hatred of Palm's politics. Or it may have been someone else entirely, an assassin whose identity remains unknown. What's certain is that the investigation was catastrophically mismanaged from the beginning, ensuring that even if the killer's identity could be determined years later, proving it legally would be impossible. Part 7. The National Trauma, 52:00-58:00 Asterisk asterisk. For Sweden, Palme's assassination was more than an unsolved murder. It was a national trauma that shattered the country's self-image. Sweden had avoided the historical catastrophes that scarred other European nations. No occupation during World War II, no terrorism, no political violence. The last Swedish leader murdered had been King Gustav III in 1792, nearly 200 years earlier. Sweden prided itself on being a peaceful, egalitarian society where leaders walked among citizens without security, where trust was the foundation of social relations. Palme's assassination destroyed that innocence. The term Stockholm Syndrome had been coined in 1973 after a bank robbery hostage situation. In 2003, Foreign Minister Anna Lindh was stabbed to death in a Stockholm department store. These incidents, along with Palme's murder, marked Sweden's loss of the assumption that it was immune to the violence plaguing other nations. The failure to solve Palme's murder compounded the trauma. Not only had Sweden's leader been killed, but the perpetrator had never been caught. The investigation's failures suggested incompetence or corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement. Trust in institutions was damaged. The case became embedded in Swedish culture. Films, books, television series, countless articles. Every Swedish citizen had an opinion about who killed Palme. The assassination was discussed, debated, theorized about in ways similar to how Americans discussed Kennedy's assassination. When the prosecutor announced in 2020 that the case was closed, many Swedes weren't satisfied. The conclusion felt incomplete. Blaming a dead man based on circumstantial evidence didn't provide the catharsis a trial and conviction would have offered. In December 2025, the Swedish prosecutor announced there was no reason to reopen the case, reaffirming that Engström remained the most likely suspect despite ongoing criticism of that conclusion. Conclusion: the Prime Minister who walked home, 58. 00-60:00 asterisk asterisk. Olof Palme was 59 years old when he was shot in the back on Sveavägen. He died because he'd insisted on living like an ordinary citizen, dismissing his bodyguards, walking home from the cinema with his wife on a Friday evening. His assassination remains officially unsolved, though Swedish prosecutors have declared they believe Stig Engström was the killer. That conclusion is contested, criticized, and ultimately unprovable given Engström's death in 2000. What's undeniable is that Palme's murder changed Sweden. It exposed the failure of institutions. It shattered assumptions about safety and trust. It remains an open wound in the national psyche, a trauma that has never fully healed because it was never fully resolved. Palme's legacy as a statesman, as a voice for international peace and social justice, endures. Streets, squares, and institutions bear his name. His contributions to Sweden's welfare state and his international activism are remembered and celebrated. But his death remains shrouded in mystery and failure. The investigation was bungled so badly it became almost as notorious as the crime itself. Theories proliferated but evidence didn't. Suspects were pursued but none convicted. After 34 years, prosecutors declared they knew who the killer was but couldn't prove it in court. For those who demand absolute certainty, Palme's case will never be satisfying. The true identity of his assassin will remain, for many, unknown. The conspiracy theories will persist. The debate will continue. But perhaps that's fitting for a crime that exposed how fragile civilization is, how quickly certainty can dissolve into chaos, how even in the safest societies violence can erupt on busy streets while ordinary people walk home from the cinema. Olof Palme believed in the possibility of a better world, in peace, in justice, in the power of international cooperation. His death demonstrated how vulnerable such ideals are, how those who champion them can be silenced by a gunman in the dark. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Palme's story. Remember not just the mystery of his death, but the substance of his life and his work. Thank you for listening tonight.